Lesson 10 begins with cardinal numbers. You learn the counting numbers 1 through 10, which is what cardinal numbers are in a previous chapter. They must be memorized like any other vocabulary. If you don't, it'll make your translating very slow and tedious. In this chapter, you learn the counting numbers 13 through 20. This lesson also introduces some somewhat irregular first conjugation verbs. In particular, they are do, sto, and uo. So you must always memorize the principal parts of all the verbs in this book, or you will eventually not be able to do the work required in this class. It will become impossible, and I still owe you a quiz specifically on principal parts. That's how important they are, and that will be a large part of the final exam. So memorizing the 4 principal parts of every verb is crucial. Remember, the 4th principal part I write out in full in the masculine, feminine, and neuter form, so it looks like more than 4 principal parts, but remember that your book only writes out the last and neuter form of that 4th principal part. All 3 of those constitute the 4th principal part. Now, the principal parts of most first conjugation verbs are very predictable, but not the following 3. It goes do, dari, dedi is particularly strange, and then datus, data, datum. Note that your book does not include some of those 4th principal parts, even in the back of the book. In the chapter itself, I think it omits this 4th principal part for sto, and in the back of the book, I don't think it has the, even in the back of the book, I don't think it has the 4th principal parts for this word. At any rate, just be aware of that, and this lesson is more complete than the book. So for do, dari, dedi, datus, datum, that word translates as give, but it is somewhat different than the normal pattern of a mo, a mari, a mawi that you've become accustomed to for principal parts in the first conjugation. Same thing with sto, stari, steti. Steti in particular is strange. It has to be memorized like all principal parts, but even worse. And then uo, uwari, and uwi. Again, that 3rd principal part is particularly unpredictable. So memorize those in particular. That will be a focus of the next quiz that you have, these irregular principal parts especially. Now, if you know those 3rd principal parts, you know how to form the indicative perfect active. That's from a previous lesson. You just take that 3rd principal part, for example, dedi, steti, or uwi, drop the I, now you've got the theme, and then you add the I, isti, it, imus, istus, erunt, or era. Remember, the book does not teach you the erunt or era option, but Real Latin uses either erunt or era, and in particular it uses the era ending in poetry, and some of the best poetry that Latin has to offer uses that ending. So if you continue on in Latin in any way, you'll have to be confronted with those that alternative ending. So memorize it, and you'll be tested on it in this class. Otherwise, there's nothing really strange about these indicative perfect actives. They just have a strange 3rd principal part to begin with. Practice them like you'd practice all the rest of the indicative perfect active until you have it down strongly. This is the easy part of the class, by the way, learning how to do these conjugations. It's tedious and slow to do this memorization, but it really is the easiest part of the class. When you start getting into advanced sentences, that's when it gets more difficult. So make sure you have all the morphology down, the conjugation and the declension, so that the rest of the class, when it gets more complicated, will come easily for you. To review, you know all the different forms of sum in the present, imperfect, perfect, and future. All of those are in the indicative mood in the active voice. You know ad sum in the same exact tenses. You know ab sum in the same exact tenses. You learn the cardinal numbers now, 1 through 20. Those are the counting numbers. They have to be memorized like any other vocabulary. you reviewed the indicative, which is the mood for facts or statements about reality, the indicative perfect active. In particular, you reviewed that because you learned 3 new verbs that are irregular first conjugation verbs, like do, sto, and uo, and you learned 3 irregular second conjugation verbs, video, maneo, and respondeo. Simple lesson. You already knew the gist of the the second conjugation anyway. You already knew everything you really need to know about the first conjugation. The indicative perfect active is not new. Some cardinal numbers are just a matter of vocabulary. And sum is the same thing. It's just a matter of the tedium of memorizing. You've got to sit down and do it at this point. It's far too deep into the course right now for you not to be memorizing 5 or 10 minutes a day. 5 or 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week, and this class will be very, very easy for you in the second semester and the rest of this semester, including the final exam. If you're not memorizing that much on a regular basis, it'll become progressively more impossible for you, and you won't be able to continue successfully. Anyway, you can call me or Skype me or write me emails if you have questions about this lesson or the quiz that you have this week. The book also introduces in this chapter some second conjugation verbs that have unpredictable principal parts. Again, most follow a pattern that I would think of as moneo, as the model. Moneo, monera, and then monoi for the third principal part. But again, the book gives you 3 models in which that's not as predictable. Wideo, widera, widdy, instead of what you might expect based on previous models, widui. Widui is not how it turns out, as you can see, obviously. And then maneo, manera, mansi, another strange one, and respondeo, respondera, respondi. The 4 principal parts, again, some of them are not listed in the book. Make sure you memorize this list of 4 principal parts because this is what you'll be tested on. Wideo means I see, maneo means I remain, respondeo means I respond. They just have slightly strange third principal parts that you need to practice. The next major point is the indicative perfect active for the verb sum. The principal parts of sum are sum, essa, fui, futuras, futura, futurum. These are highly irregular principal parts, which is not surprising because this is a highly irregular verb in all forms. So again, this shows you the importance of memorizing the principal parts. You can't get by in this class without knowing the principal parts. You're lucky you don't have to speak Latin. What you do have to do to make up for that time, I suppose you would spend practicing speaking or pronouncing Latin, is work on your declensions and your conjugations and make sure you know all of your principal parts. Here's a review of all the different tenses you know so far for the verb to be. This is the indicative present active. Sum est, sumus estis sunt. That's the present tense in the indicative mood, and the active voice, it means I am, you are, he, she, or it is, we are, you plural are, and they are. The next one over is the indicative imperfect active. This you learned a while ago as well. Eram is I was, or I used to be. Eras is you were. Erat is he, she, or it was. Eramus is we were, or we used to be. Eratus is you all were. And erant is they were, or they used to be. Fui is the new one. Fui is the indicative perfect active. It's distinguished from the imperfect, and that's a crucial part of this lesson as well, is to understand this difference between the perfect and the imperfect. For fui, it translates as, again, I have been is a good translation for that. It's not impossible for you to translate that as I was, just like the imperfect. But you have to understand that these two tenses are not the same. One emphasizes the ongoing nature of the action, that's the imperfect. The other emphasizes the completed nature of the action. Both take place in the past tense, in the past time, but one, that is to say the imperfect, emphasizes the ongoingness of something, and the other emphasizes the completeness of something. It's a very subtle point. I understand that it may be beyond the subtlety that you understand at this level, but just practice distinguishing the two of them. Do not confuse them and treat them as if they're the same. I suggest you translate them differently in spite of what the book does or in spite of what you might find online elsewhere, so that you keep them straight in your head. So fui would be I have been, fuisti would be something like you have been. Fuit obviously would be something like he has been, or she has been, or it has been. Fuimus, we have been. Fuistis, you all have been. And then fuerunt, something like they have been. Again, I really couldn't mark it wrong if you translated the perfect as was, just like the imperfect, but I don't want you to confuse these for the long term. They're very similar, and it's a subtle difference, but try to maintain that subtle difference so that you don't ultimately get confused. And then the furthest one over to the right, clean this up, is the indicative future active. So this next tense, the indicative future active, we'll translate as I will be, you will be, he, she, or it will be, we will be, you all will be, and they will be. Sorry, that's gotten a little cluttered. I'll clean it up. Okay, now just to review quickly, the indicative present is the first one. It's active voice. The indicative imperfect is the second one. That's a past tense that can be translated as, for example, I was, or I used to be. The next one is the perfect. That's a new one for today. That may also be translated as I was. I would prefer, however, that unless your translation sounds very awkward, I would prefer that instead of translating it as I was, you try to translate it as I have been. Either one works for fui. I have been or I was. Whichever one sounds more natural in your translation. But I just need you to keep the difference between these two separate. One is the past tense, that is the ongoing past tense, that's the imperfect. And the other one, the perfect, is the past tense, that is the completed past tense. A subtle distinction, but make sure you know it. The last one is the future. That translates as I will be. Pretty simple. It's just a matter of memorizing sum as est, sumus estis sunt. Don't just do it top to bottom, do it backwards. Sunt estis sumus, est es sum. And then do it left to right as well. Pick one order, namely the order that I presented in, so that you have something consistent, and then practice sum eram fui ero, and know how each of them is translated. be able to do sum eram fui ero, es eras fuisti eris, est erat fuit erit, sumus eramus fuimus eramus, and know how to translate each of those forms. They're going to be all over Latin sentences in this book and all Latin that you will read. This list right here is very crucial. Speaking of the verb sum and how important it is, the book introduces two other forms of sum, or compound forms of sum. The verb ad sum, which you can see up here, the principal parts are essentially the same as sum, but with an ad compounded to it. So very similar to what you've already seen. And then the present, indicative present active, is not any different except it has ad in front of it. So that makes it easy. And the indicative imperfect is the same. And the indicative perfect is the same. And the future is the same. So relatively simple. Sorry that the formatting is a little bit off down here. The spacing is not quite where it should be. But you can see what goes with what. There, that's not beautiful, but it does show you what goes where. Note the alternative form down here, where you have fuerunt and fuera, and then adderunt is part of the future. The future, the perfect, the imperfect, and the present. Ad sum means I am near or I am present. Ad eram means I was near or I used to be present. Ad fui means I have been present or I was present. And addero means I will be present or I will be near. Very little that's challenging about this if you've already memorized the verb sum. This is just a compound form of that, and nothing changes in the conjugation. Something does change in this page, and again, I'm sorry for the strange formatting. When I switch it from Google Docs into the Explain Everything app, sometimes things are changed that I'm not aware of at first. The thing that changes is in the principal parts, and then therefore in the conjugation as well, it goes ab sum, ab essa, a fui. That's not a typo. There is no there's no B there. But then the B returns in this fourth principal part. This again is an illustration of why principal parts are necessary to memorize. You would never be able to predict that. The only people that would really know that that was coming would be native speakers, and nobody is a native speaker of Latin anymore. Otherwise, it conjugates in the present the same way. It just adds ab in front of it. The imperfect conjugates in the same way. It just adds ab. The perfect drops the B all the way through, just like in the principal part. That's why I have to memorize the principal part. What happens in the principal part happens everywhere else. And then finally, the future, is nothing strange about that. Nothing unpredictable about it. And then ab sum, instead of meaning I am present, ab sum, as you can probably guess from the word like absunt down here, ab sum, instead of meaning I am near or I am present, means I am absent. So ab sum, for example, would mean I am not present, or I am not near, or I am absent, or I am apart. Ab eram would mean I was absent. A fui would mean I was absent, or I have been absent. And ab ero means I will be absent, or I will be apart. Ad sum is the opposite of ab sum. In the previous screen you learned ad sum, and this screen is ab. Ab in Latin means away. Sum means I am. Ad in Latin means to or toward. Sum means I am. Pretty simple lesson overall in this lesson 10. It's a matter of memorizing sum, est, and all the various forms. You know 4 tenses for that now.